Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Gary Sinclair. This webinar series is presented jointly by the FIA, DCU, and the United Against Online Abuse Coalition. The aim of this series is to bring together scholars and sport industry stakeholders from across the globe to disseminate research, share experiences, and develop collaborative projects on the subject of online abuse. Online abuse is a significant problem in sport, as is recognised by the increasing media coverage, the growing attention it has received at an academic level, and the development of initiatives such as the UAOA Coalition. In our first webinar, Dr. Colm Kearns will present findings from work he has published with a network of sports scholars in communication and sport. His work looks at the history of academic research on the subject of online hate in sport. The inaugural webinar with Dr. Kearns will be followed by monthly webinars from scholars from across the globe.
I'm honoured to open up this seminar series. So as Gary was saying, this is going to be focused on the state of play in the academic research that has been conducted up until this point into the problem of online hate in sport. And hopefully then I suppose that will give everyone here, both scholars and non-scholars, a grounding in what has been done so far and how we can build on that and do more in the future. So this research, just to give a bit of background about it, it was drawn from a scoping review Gary, I, and several colleagues in the TOEIF, or Tackling Online Hate and Football project, done at the start of our research, whereby we conducted a review into the research into online hate in sport. It's been subsequently published in Communication and Sport. That was like roughly, it's published in 2023. I'd say, I mean, roughly the writing of it was about a year, 18 months ago, and it's some indication as to how quickly this field of research is growing. That when we conducted that review that is now available in Communication and Sport, there were 41 texts that we found that fell under our criteria as relevant peer-reviewed research into online hate in sport. In this updated review that I'll be now presenting to you now, that we have conducted on behalf of DCU's collaboration with the FIA, we found 66 texts using broadly the same criteria. So in that very short amount of time, we've seen the amount of research go up by quite a bit, which speaks about, obviously there's a good and a bad side to that. It's certainly positive that there's more research being conducted into this problem and it's been paid greater attention, but obviously the research underlines that it is a growing problem, and one that to a large extent is still seriously in need of being addressed. So just then to give you a grounding in how we went about this review, we conducted it through Scopus, the online repository of academic material. Their database goes as far back as the start of the millennium. So our search went from the start of the millennium up until when the date we conducted it in October 2023. It was focused largely on this matter of online hate, online abuse, which is complicated by, and I'll speak a bit about this later, but it's complicated by the fact that there's a lot of overlapping but ultimately distinctive terms that are used to talk about this problem. So you have terms like online hate, hate speech, that are linked to attacks on protected characteristics, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and so forth. You have the more broad online abuse that can encompass that, but can also extend to, say, threats, harassment that need not be attacks on protected characteristics. You have cyberbullying that tended in its initial form to be linked to traditional interpretations of bullying, which were of course based on a persistent approach from an individual, whereas the other online abuse, online hate, may encompass a single attack, as it were. So we threw a fairly broad net in how we defined this, largely just distinguishing it from any kind of offline behaviors of bullying or hate or abuse. There is some crossover in those to a degree, but ours focused solely on the online. We limited ourselves to peer-reviewed journal papers, excluding conference papers, book chapters, and non-scholarly publications. And while perhaps the non-scholarly publications are, an understandable exclusion in any study into academic research, the exclusion of book chapters. There's might very likely some valuable work done there, but we just run up against practical boundaries in the availability of this material to us for us to be able to get it and assess it in detail. Peer-reviewed journal papers were much more available in that regard. And then you have the last point there, written in the English language. And I'll ask you to bear that one in mind as we go ahead and we look at some of the trends in what the papers tend to focus on, the context they tend to focus on. There's certainly an Anglophone Western bias there that to some extent, is understandable when you're looking at English language or material available in the English language. But I think given that the English language is I suppose the dominant language largely through a lot of how a lot of international academic collaborations are conducted, there's certainly a need to extend that focus beyond the Anglophone world. So I just mentioned there about the upsurge in this the research into this area, and to give you some idea of that, we have a table here just displaying how the number of publications has trended upwards over time. And what you have is essentially we have kind of three distinct phases in research into academic research into online hate and sport. The first phase from 2000 to 2014, where there's only six outputs that under our criteria that were published in that period. And then a second phase from 2015 through 2021, where we see a big uptick. There's 31 articles published in this degree. Obviously, this encompasses a time period where not only social media use is growing enormously throughout the wider public and its integration into major sports media events and so forth, but also a time of significant social political upheaval. Again, to go back to that Anglophone matter, we have the election of Donald Trump as US president, the Brexit referendum, and so forth, and a general kind of cultural political polarization that saw sport, amongst many other things, being pulled into this notion of a culture war and being something that is discussed with perhaps more heatedly than it had hitherto been in these online platforms. And then lastly, we have most recently from third phase from 2022 to 2023, where there's a further 29 publications in just over a year. So again, this is really an enormously quickly growing field of research. And while there are many factors involved in that, we can perhaps point to two major flashpoint sporting events that are sort of explain or illustrate the developments during those second two phases. So firstly, on the left there, we have Colin Kaepernick, the American footballer's protest of systemic racism in the US through his gesture of kneeling during the playing of the US national anthem. That protest took place in 2016, and you see subsequent to that a significant kind of upsurge in investigations into online hate in sport, not a small amount of which are focused on the Kaepernick case or related cases. And then secondly, that last phase that we mentioned from 2022 to 2023 can perhaps be linked to the outpouring of racist abuse that followed the Euro 2020 final, confusingly held in 2021, whereby you had three black English players, Saka, Sancho, and Rashford, miss penalties in the crucial shootout in the final against Italy and suffer an enormous amount of racist abuse on social media accordingly. And this was certainly something of a watershed event in terms of the mainstream media and the British political establishment's awareness or willingness to be seen to act over this issue. Obviously, it's something academics and concerned interest groups have been aware of for quite some time. But that issue, putting it on the map to an even greater extent, as it were, I think to some degree explains or helps explain that third phase and a huge upsurge of research into this area we've seen. So that though our study then of that research conducted from 2000 up until October 2023 encompassed 66 peer-reviewed academic papers that were primarily concerned with online hate and sport. As I said, we disqualified anything that was only tangentially concerned with online hate and sport, and of course anything non-academic material or any academic material not published in the English language. So then to look in detail at those 66 papers, when we uh, and what they reveal about the state of play with regard to research. So first of all, we have the sports that are examined. Over 75% of the articles that we examined focus on just 10 sports, four of which in soccer or football, American football, basketball, and Australian rules football. Those four sports account for 60%, the focus of 60% of the articles we've seen there. To an extent, this isn't surprising. Soccer or association football is, of course, the world's most popular sport. It's perhaps no surprise that it's the focus of a huge amount of research. And the Kaepernick events again, and the US as a, I suppose, as a frequent battleground for these sport culture wars. Again, explain the focus on American football, basketball, and so on. But it does point to, I suppose, like a neglect or a area that can further be researched in terms of looking at different uh, sports and how these issues of online hate manifest themselves and are played out in those different sporting contexts. We're all sports scholars and likely sports fans here, so we know that kind of different sports tend to have quite different cultures, quite different fan cultures that then color how these issues of online abuse and online hate play out across them. And I'll draw your attention to this bottom figure here of general or various, because this referred to papers that focused on kind of sport in a very general sense. I just, sports fans' reactions to this or discussions of sport on this platform under that time. There were so while you have the papers that focus specifically on a single sport and these 16 papers to focus on sports more widely, very few of the papers, I think it was only one or two, actually focused, like say, took two sports and done a compare contrast exercise of how the different of how these discourses manifested themselves and played out in those different sports. So that might be perhaps a fertile ground in need of exploring further in the future. When it comes to the context of the countries or the cultures that form the focus of the subjects of these articles, the case studies in which this research is being conducted on. Again, we see an Anglophone focus there with uh, the US, the UK, and Australia accounting for over half, or in Canada for that matter, accounting for over half of the research conducted into that area. So there's a potential for a lot more there to be done in kind of um, seeing how these things play out in different across different countries as well. When it comes to the online platforms that these papers tended to focus on, we see a preponderance towards Twitter or X as it's now known, and this is perhaps understandable as Twitter operates at a more real time level to a lot of other social media platforms, so it's particularly suited to live discourses over live sporting events playing out. Um, and it's not only a popular medium for sport, but also for social and political views. You have the kind of the hashtag nature of it, making it more of an open social network in which discussions happen, not only with other users that someone is part of a network with, be it they friends or followers, but also just with other users that are discussing the same issue. And under such structures, it's understandable that these arguments, these examples of online hate would play out accordingly. But of course, in the years since a lot of these research been conducted, there's been major changes, notably an ownership change to Twitter. Its API is now significantly more expensive and more difficult for academic researchers to get a hold of, to purchase data through than had previously been the case. So we may well see a change in the future as regards that what has hitherto been largely a focus on Twitter. The other side of that focus too is the emergence of newer social media platforms such as TikTok, Snapchat, that tend to be more image based. So that certainly presents challenges to researchers in focusing on in trying to find ways to analyze images over text, but they're challenges that are certainly worth meeting because these platforms are obviously growing hugely popular and will be undoubtedly the battlegrounds, for want of a better term, on which future instances of online hate and sport are playing out or have indeed already been played out. Another potentially under-examined area is what we might call more niche social platforms, such as Trust Social, Gab, where users with more extremist views may feel more comfortable expressing those views than they would in more mainstream platforms. So research into those backstage spaces could yield interesting insights into online hate and sport that may not necessarily be there when one looks at a more mainstream social media platform such as Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. So in terms of the types of hate speech that these papers tended to examine, we see again rate over 75% of the work focused on racism, misogyny, or homophobia. So there's certainly certain prejudices there that are under examined or ripe for further examination. Again, here we're going on to kind of the idea of hate as being based on an attack on real or attributed characteristics such as race, color, language, religion, nationality, ethnic origin, age, disability, sex, or gender identity. That final category there of general abuse covers instances where we had attacks that couldn't really be linked to any of those characteristics, but nonetheless where instances of online abuse playing out in a sporting context, be it a athlete being threatened or harassed or doxed or whatever it may or whatever else it may be. The majority of research tended to focus on instances in which fans and social media users more widely attacked athletes or participants with it, with a small amounts of them occasionally looking at attacks on journalists too. Very little looking at attacks on fans, be they by fans attacking other fans, and this does point to a danger we may be stumbling into as researchers in kind of pathologizing sports fans and regarding them as a potential problem to be managed rather than as another stakeholder who can be taken on board in the battle against online abuse in sport. You also see that final category there referring to marginalized groups in general. So this is whereby you have research that looks at um, cultures that use discussions about a sporting event or just a sport in general as a way of, they may not be kind of like, say, they may not be abusing a particular athlete or official or journalist, but they're more sort of using general, say, homophobic or racist or misogynist terms or what have you. And in this way, the hate speech is kind of used to delegitimize the participation of that marginalized group in the sport more widely, be that participation as a fan or as a athlete or journalist or official. So in that way, it's kind of hate speech filling a more abstract function than an attack on an individual. Instead, it's kind of underlining the in-group and out-group boundaries of a particular sport being used to kind of, I suppose, um, policed who is allowed to be a fan or be a participant in the sport and who is not allowed to do it. So, as I said, the majority of those papers then tend to focus on these instances of fans or users attacking athletes. And we'll have a brief look now at how they what are the trends with regards to the solutions they propose. I should say not all of the 66 papers we looked at were necessarily framed in terms of providing solutions. Some of them, their purpose was simply to document these instances of online hate and shed what light they could on it. But some of them did do work in the way of recommendations and solutions, and he's varied in terms of they might be, recommendations for sports administrators, for wider sports media, for policymakers, or for other academics. So when we look at that, we see that there's, oh, sorry, I jumped ahead there. There's kind of four different ways of addressing this problem that you can look at, either strengthening the legal frame, the policies around it, and how it is policed and legislated for, the automated identification of cyber hate, so the more kind of algorithmic approach, and the tools by which the platforms themselves or online watchdogs might be able to automatically detect and fight this stuff. Education and training to, illuminate, I suppose, like illuminate the gravity of online hate and sport, and in doing so, hopefully create a culture by which it is less likely to happen in the future. And counter communication, be it kind of individual users um, replying or fighting instances of online hate and sport as they see it, or kind of counter communication strategies by institutional stakeholders such as major media bodies and covering sport, or sports administration bodies and so on. And most of the papers in our review tended to place their emphasis on education, on this need for to uh educate users as to the gravity of online hate and sport, and what it could do. Obviously, this is uh I suppose ultimately somewhat speculative, and it does suggest that the greater research is required on the effectiveness of intervention strategies, i.e., what has been done so far and how effective has it been in actually addressing this problem. Because until that research is conducted, the papers looking at this issue are largely building their recommendations on somewhat speculative or hypothetical grounds. And another point to take account of in when looking at the recommendations and conclusions that most of the research into this area drew, is that most of them tend to go beyond viewing anonymity as the chief factor in fostering online abuse. They talk about the kind of cultures that develop within the sports or on the social media platforms that make it I suppose, be seen by some users as an acceptable space to vent in a hateful fashion against other fans or against athletes and so on. And I think this is worth noting because it's tended to be, when this issue has been covered by, say, the more mainstream media, or by governmental policymakers, they tend to characterize anonymity as among the bigger problems that is causing this culture of online hate and sport. And according to the research, at least, that doesn't really seem to be the case. And it's probably worth noting that when Twitter talked about their response to the aforementioned instance of racial abuse against the three English players who missed the penalties in the final of Euro 2020. They issued a statement saying that 99% of users they had banned for engaging in racist abuse were identifiable. So that would point towards a finding that really anonymity isn't a huge issue in determining, in shaping this culture whereby users engage in hateful abuse of athletes or fans or participants and so on, and that attempts to address this accordingly cannot just focus on trying to wrestle with anonymity. So when it came to the research methods of the research that's been conducted into this so far, we see most of them tended to focus on the vast majority on secondary data, i.e., on data they had either purchased or analyzed in some other fashion from social media platforms or other online platforms. There was little in the way of generating the data themselves, either through interviews or surveys or what else. And there's definitely, I suppose, like holes that leaves in our understanding of the problem. Like by not engaging in primary data, we maybe lack the input of certain stakeholders into what might be the ramifications of that this online hate has in sport, the difficulties and challenges to come with dealing it, perhaps insights into previous attempts to deal with it. But it should be said, gathering primary data on such a sensitive issue does have significant practical barriers. So again, there's API costs, which ever more complicated with the or data purchasing costs, I should say, ever more complicated with the recent change to the Twitter API. We also have the sensitivity of the area of discussing instances of hate and abuse and so on, make it more difficult to gather and gather data through interviews or testimonies from people who have been involved with this problem than would otherwise be the case. So it is certainly vitally important that future research into this area generates more of its own data and takes more of a wider approach than simply taking chunks of data from social media around a given instance of online hate and sport flaring up and analyzing that, and instead trying to net wider and kind of speaking to whether it's people from the platforms themselves, sports administrators, journalists, and so on. But there are barriers to that. Uh, it should be noticed too. Again, we have a majority of the research tended to be qualitative, with only just over a quarter being mixed methods, which combined both quants and quals, which would kind of point to an maybe underutilized potential to do some very innovative mixed methods research, combining both quantitative analysis of big social media data of instances of online hate and sport with maybe qualitative nuance, whereby insights can be gathered from the various stakeholders. And that's something we're engaged in at the moment in the TOEIC project, and to an extent in our collaboration with the FIA as well. But it's definitely something that is a largely untapped area in this rapidly growing research field. So something to be bared in mind. So that is the kind of somewhat concise picture of these 66 texts we identified as being the relevant research, relevant peer-reviewed research heretofore conducted into online hate in sport. So to take them as a whole, then where does that leave us with regard to this field at the moment, and where does this field of investigating online hate in sport might go in the future? Well, there's a couple of conclusions to be bear in mind. Um, Firstly, is including a wider range of sports. Again, we particularly Paralympic sports, where we have the otherwise under researched prejudice of ableism probably flaring up in that. So again, we saw that like a small handful of sports account for the vast majority of research done in this area. Different sports have different cultures, different supports behind them. So there definitely could be more gleaned by looking going beyond the usual suspects of association football, American football, Aussie rules, and so on, and then looking at how different sports, how this issue of online hate has played out in them. Widening the coverage of online hate speech to include under-researched types of hate speech: transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, sectarianism, ableism, and also the relationships between these. I suppose an intersectional approach to hate, whereby we look at this, these double instances of these hate speech playing out in the against the one or set amount of targets. Again, extending the number of online platforms into which the online hate research in sport is conducted, including encrypted message platforms, niche social media platforms, and the darknet. So to get that sense of backstage instances of hate, as it were. It's perhaps understandable that the research heretofore is focused on the front stage, as again, when the bulk of it tends to look at instances of fans and users abusing athletes, they are of course front stage spaces, because I suppose the concern in this regard is seeing that, well, like the athletes can see this hate, this abuse being directed towards them, that of course has emotional, personal, professional ramifications on them, and that is in turn worthy of study. But I think we can throw the net a bit wider here in looking at these backstage spaces, whether it be the darknet or kind of niche social media platforms, Gab, Parler, and so on, as spaces whereby maybe the targeted athletes, they may not see and feel the full brunt of that hate themselves, but those spaces are where the kind of the cultures of hate are being fermented and are being kind of fostered, that will ultimately play out on the more front stage spaces at a later date. Uh, Again, extending the research into under-examined cultures, context of sport, developing our understandings on the effectiveness of different measures and measure designs to combat online hate and sport at different levels. So this is perhaps a sign of the relatively young age of this emerging field. As you said, the vast majority of research into it has been conducted within the last decade, and as such, we are still in quite a speculative realm when it comes to assessing what is actually successful, what is effective in both fighting against the spread of online hate, but it also mitigating its impacts in supporting the people who are targeted by those impacts, be they athletes, journalists, fans, officials, whatever. And we're at we still haven't gathered a huge amount of research into measuring that effectiveness. So that's certainly something that can be done. And lastly, increasing the volume of longitudinal, large-scale comparative research on online hate speech in sports. So hitherto, a lot of the research we examine tend to be incident based. So it focused on a particular incident, be it, say, an athlete's perceived transgression in the sports arena or outside of it, or say a particular game or tournament or so on. It would then take the online discussion on a given platform or sometimes platforms that played out in response to this particular flashpoint incident and analyze it. And while there's a lot to be learned from that, there hasn't been a lot done in the way of taking a more longitudinal approach and seeing how these instances of online hate play out over, say, a sporting season or over even several years, how they evolve in that matter. Do they grow? Do they shrink? How do they relate to wider socio-political currents in the wider world? Again, in looking at sport, we can't fall into the trap of, I suppose, putting sport in a silo of sorts and imagining that it is unaffected by broader socio-political currents. So there could be a lot of interesting insights yielded with that more longitudinal approach, while there are more certainly practical barriers in the way of conducting it. It's worth doing. Um, so, Lastly, then, what can be done to accomplish this? Well, large scale interdisciplinary collaboration, again, to build more mixed methods approach that is able to combine the breadth of quantitative analysis of huge amounts of social media data with the nuance of qualitative analysis that can engage with different stakeholders in this issue. International research networks, again, to broaden the picture beyond the same familiar context and familiar sports being examined, both of which will need this third point here, which is comprehensive funding. Any sports academics out there can know that it can be sometimes like, running up against a brick wall and trying to convince funders and academic gatekeepers of the importance of sport to wider culture and areas of wider economy and politics. But as I said, when it comes to taking the next steps in taking a more longitudinal interdisciplinary approach when it comes to the costs of purchasing data and engaging with other stakeholders, it is something that is going to require funding. So comprehensive funding networks emerging through key stakeholders in this issue, like sports administrators, like government policymakers, could really go some way towards building a robust future for the study of online hate and sport that goes beyond the more incident-based approaches we've seen so far that look at a given flashpoint incident and a reaction to that, and takes a kind of both wider and more in-depth approach to looking at it that engages, as we can see in this 4 point, with different stakeholders, policymakers, platforms, and sports government to take those findings beyond academia into something that can be used to build solutions to this across all those different stakeholders. Because one thing that looking through this research has shown me and my colleagues that while I feel somewhat guilty here, and that I feel as if like the preceding half hour has been me largely pointing out the limitations of this research so far. That's largely been done to kind of open the door to point the way in where future research can go. Because I think the stuff that has been done so far has been incredibly valuable. And we all stand on the shoulders of giants, so that the future research will have that past research to thank. But one thing that is clear is that academic research has tended to be ahead of the curve on this when compared to sports governing bodies and national, international governments and policymakers, who it's only very relatively recently that a lot of those have begun to take real measures in supporting their staff and their athletes against this. And that's come in the last, when it comes to, say, reports published by major international sports bodies into online hate and sport, those have all been published in the last 3 to 4 years. Whereas, as we've seen through this research, the academic research into online hate and sport goes back 20 research. The bulk of it goes back at least, or goes back 20 years. The bulk of it goes back at least 10 years. So academic research has been ahead of the curve when compared to governments and sports administration bodies in addressing this. So, if governments and sports administration bodies are to effectively address this in the future, it would certainly behoove them to engage with academics on how they might go about that. And equally, it would behoove academics to engage with them in then taking making outputs for their findings that go beyond an academic audience. So I hope that has gone. I realized that was a bit stats heavy, but I hope it has gone some way towards painting a picture for all of you into where we are at the moment as regards the state of play when it comes to academic research into this issue of online hate and sport. So with that, I'll stop sharing. And if anyone has any questions or any further discussion points, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Thanks very much, Colm. I'd say, and we have some hands already. Just raise the hands. For if you have a question, it's just easier because we have quite a lot of people here. Anna, you have your hand up. You have a question for Colm.
Hello, thank you so much for this webinar. I know I am very excited to be here. I know I cited you for my research project, so it's very good to
Thanks.
receive this talk. And so I guess I was just wondering, and I have two questions, but I guess we talk a lot about, how it is a present today of online hate and all what is going on. So I guess one of my questions is like, where do you see this trend going? So not only in the present, but for the future, like where do you see online hate speech in sports going? Is it because I know that there's more papers because there's more research, but also you can say that maybe it's not that it's also more hate, but like we are identifying it more rather than being more hate. I don't know if I explained that correctly. I guess that's one of my questions. And the other one is that I also believe that there is a lot of underreported. So because I saw that figure you said on, a lot of these texts going to athletes, and that's, they are like all the attention of sports goes towards the athlete that it's actually, doing the sport. And that's, I guess that's why a lot of these messages are toward them. But also, do you believe that there is an underreport of hate going towards officials or marshals, for example, in racing events? I know I know one of my colleagues in Mexico have said it, sometimes it's very hard to be a woman that is an official and all of that. So I just guess that my two questions essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks very much, Anna. Yeah, I mean, I think as inevitably, like as social media use grows more widely, unfortunately, like hate will grow with it unless we can find really effective ways of combating that. So, I mean, as to where this goes in the future, unfortunately, like like far right organizations and activists have been very quick historically to pick up on emerging technologies. If you go back way into the early days of the internet, you find kind of I think like Stormfront still the neo-Nazi, like they're one of the oldest websites around, and finding ways of kind of loopholing or navigating their way around rule-based or kind of algorithmic ways to search around this. So, if it would be a rather kind of blunt hammer for major platforms just to have a dictionary of offensive terms and say, oh, well, we'll just automatically moderate based on this, because inevitably they will find some way around it, whether it's kind of text and image based use of emojis or memes or so on. So I definitely see it kind of, it will, it's kind of like, the Greek myth of the Hydra, like you cut off one head and another two grow. As efforts to kind of combat it grow, it will then evolve to try to get around those efforts. And I think like as academics and as anyone trying to address this, uh, I think we've got to be as adaptable ourselves in fighting that, and not kind of uh, think, oh, we've hit on the ideal solution here, that's it, that's problem solved. Uh, but also not getting too disheartened by the fact that it may be impossible maybe to, like wipe it out totally. I suppose it's like, if you're a sailor and you navigate yourself by the North Star, but you don't ever expect to actually reach the North Star when you're sailing on the sea. Equally, as kind of, academics is, we navigate ourselves by like aspiring towards perfection, aspiring towards fully, wiping out or addressing this problem, while being cognizant that we might not ever actually reach there, but in the efforts to get there, we'll be continually adaptable. And certainly in how we do that, I think like image, meme, video based thing is definitely where the research is going to have to go, because that's where social media is going, particularly with something like TikTok, and there hasn't been a huge amount of research done there. As to your second question on officials, yeah, I definitely think it's a really under researched area, and I think it's sort of a um one that's it's ripe for researching, because I think one of the things that makes sports such an interesting context to look at, online hate, online abuse is a wider problem anyway, in different kind of fields, different across, but sport, because it's in its nature to stir up our passions, and for us to kind of see sports contests, teams, individuals as sort of totemic of wider identities and cultures, be that like the obvious one of teams representing different nations, or other things. Because of that, there's like culturally, sport has kind of existed in this weird sort of like rhetorical gray area where, we kind of see a certain amount of heated discourse that would be unacceptable in other contexts as acceptable, so long as it plays out within the confines of sport and sporting arena. And I want to say, I don't think that's entirely unhealthy. Like, I think there probably is something, good in these sports contexts being places where you can kind of scream and shout in a way that you can't otherwise. But when it comes to officials, that has certainly been like, the I've just anecdotally, I've been at like football matches where I've seen people I know shout things at referee that like they would never say in any other context of their lives. So like it's for that to kind of be, and I think like that has gone unaddressed for a while, because there's this sense of, well, it's just limited to the confines of the 90 minutes, 60 minutes, 2 hours, or whatever the sporting event goes on for. Now, what happens when this plays out online is that it becomes unavoidable. It becomes constant for those officials or those officials' families, if their decisions are being kind of used as sticks to beat them with, if they're being kind of, threatened and attacked online. Like I suppose sports governing bodies and anyone wants to address this can no longer say, oh yeah, well, officials get terrible abuse, but at least it's just for this one concentrated period, and then they can go home and live their lives. Now they're constantly dealing with, and yet it certainly is under researched from an academic point of view. So there's definitely more room to explore there.
Roshni, you got your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. Colm, on just two questions. There's a lot of focus on football and a lot of research has been done. And then we've got this FIA coalition that's been set up. Is there collaboration, or is there competition between the two? I'm not so sure. I've tried to read between the lines, because that's important. And the other is the thing that struck me was around this concept of anonymity, and the fact that sporting bodies and the media and maybe governments are behind using that as a rationale, potentially because that's what has been reported most until now. The research may not show it, but what was your sense? Is that somehow a case of shirking accountability? Because once you say, you know what, we actually know who the people are, you've got to go after them and do something about it. Is there resistance to take ownership for the issue at this stage?
Thanks very much, Roshni. With the first question on the FIA and the football collaborations, Gary is probably better placed to answer those as PI in both of them. But there is some sort of overlap in that the TOEIF, the project in which we're looking at online hate and football, essentially led to this collaboration with the FIA. They contacted us on the back of that initial scoping review we done into online hate and sport that I mentioned at the start for that's published in Communication and Sport, and that began that collaboration out of it. So, in that sense, there's I suppose it's quite a positive sign of like research and attempts to address this issue, breeding other research and attempts to address this issue. But certainly, when looking at the bigger picture, there is, I suppose, there could be a lot to be done in bringing international sporting bodies together more widely to look at this rather than different. While they all have their own specific cultural contexts, and you can't be too homogenous in the way you look at them. I definitely think there would be a lot to be gained by a more unified kind of approach, or at least like a network set up where they can kind of share resources on this point. I believe this is an ambition of the FIAs to.
That's the point of the UAOA, is to bring together different federations to tackle the problem. Because I think like the big issue is probably identified in that paper as well, is that you have so many different sporting organizations that have economic, cultural, social differences and different approaches that they're taking maybe at the micro level to the problem, but that kind of adds further layers to the complexity. So the better that you can, I suppose, come together and try to standardize approaches here, the more efficient sport can be in responding to the issue. But again, that's easier said than done.
Absolutely. And my thought there, sorry, Colm, just to
Yeah.
kind of contextualize where I'm coming from, is that from the perspective of administration and justice systems, we're assuming if you have two camps, let's just call it that, two big wigs running these projects, is that you assume that the fans, who are the current big perpetrators, are following one sport stream. And the issue is once they get used to communicating in a certain form with a huge sport like football, that may be replicated as a natural course in other sports. And therefore, this principle, I see it in business, and you probably do, that we talk about collaboration, but there's not an understanding because by nature, both sport and business are wired around competition. So in these types of things, even the how to bring players around the table is going to be in itself an art that we can perhaps somehow help facilitate.
Yeah, absolutely, Roshni, because I think both in the sense of that there's the danger of the approach taken for the bigger sports like football just being kind of mapped like rather lumpedly and roughly onto other sports. But I think equally there's because both the research and the media attention tends to focus on high profile sporting events of major sports. There's also perhaps the danger of smaller sports kind of washing their hands of this as oh, this is a football problem, this is a basketball problem, and kind of not taking account that this might be playing out, albeit on a smaller scale, with their athletes or their fans and so on. So from both sides, there is a risk of that competitive nature playing out in a way that isn't conducive to addressing this. To go back to what you were asking earlier about anonymity, I can't put myself like entirely in the shoes of when it comes to like government officials and when they talk about this or major media figures, but I think consciously or unconsciously there is certainly like it is taking maybe the easy approach in imagining that anonymity is the main problem. One, because it kind of presupposes that dealing with this is like almost like a one-step process where if you could kind of pass a bit of legislation that makes everyone have to have public social media profiles, bam, problem solved, rather than doing something more nuanced and more long term. And two, it then washes their hands of what how has kind of like national cultures and education and other factors, how have they played a role in fostering an environment where people feel empowered and entitled to sit down at their keyboards or on their phones and spew out this bile against complete strangers. Like, governments and other stakeholders may have more to answer for in that regard, but if they focus on anonymity, they are then largely putting the ball in the court to the social media platforms to do something about it. And that's not, leaving aside too with the major issue of, like, when it comes to kind of anonymity in social media and government stance on that, you have in a lot of countries it being perhaps the only way in which people feel safe to voice critique of the governments being through anonymous social media accounts. So, we can in some cases look quite skeptically on governments talking about online anonymity being a unilaterally negative thing for society, when in fact it might help foster genuine critique of them that doesn't exist elsewhere.
Colm, Theo has had his hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, Theo.
I think Amy's in a good
Your
place.
hand must be killing you.
I had these
He's in a good
virtual
place to respond
hands.
to Rosh's
No,
first question too.
yeah, no, thanks. It was a good presentation, Colm. I think one of the questions, just to go back to Roshni's point, I think one of the difficulties is you have the UN have a countering hate speech through sports working committee and working group, but they kind of very much focus on what I would call hate speech nearly as a hate crime, and it's a very US centric coalition, which is very different. I think then the other thing which I think is coming out of Colm's work, and really how we're continuing it on more recently on this project, is the blurry line between online hate and hate speech and then offensive language and online abuse and different types of online harm. I think that nuance gets very caught up in this thing where we say, well, here's hate speech. Hate speech is a very tiny part of the discussion. The big part of the discussion is a general degradation of civility in sporting life. And so when you look at this concept of lack of civility, which is very culturally nuanced, what do we know? We know, even when we think about all that research, people are focusing on, I'm going to focus on hate speech. And then one of the things that we know is when we sort of unravel that particular onion, it becomes a very, very complex beast, and it's different in different countries. And so, this idea of feminine slurs versus sexism towards women versus appropriation of different words, so it's become a much more nuanced space. And we're only looking at language. And Colm kind of hints at the thing, well, there's video and there's image and there's audio and there's all these things. We only look at a very, very small amount of social media, which tends to be the most open and public social media. So when we start looking at gray social media, darknet social media, or even encrypted messaging, say like in Brazil, WhatsApp will be used a lot for people to have their discussion. When we get into that kind of context, it's a very, very different and probably a much more granular level of offensive and online abuse and online speech. And I say this because a lot of online abuse doesn't happen in social media. It happens directly to the individual. So it might be emails, it might be phone calls, it might be hate mail. It could be just going up to them on the street, and so online abuse carries through into the real world. And so on top of that, we're very Anglo-centric. And the reason I raise this is I see we have some people from Tunisia, and we recently started looking at the AFCON data set that we have, and I couldn't even start to think about what online abuse in AFCON is, because it's going to be much more nuanced and it's going to be much more culturally and tribal type of thing in many cases. But I do know that when it came, myself and Colm were looking at the Qatar World Cup, and it really is the first time we see massive Islamophobia, and we see Islamophobia from non-Islam people to Islam people, between Shias and Sunnis, between different countries. It's a very nuanced thing, and that one topic really not covered in the sociology literature, certainly. So when we're looking at this, we're only starting. Do you know what I mean? We haven't even really scratched the surface. And Roshni, when we were talking recently, you're saying, oh, well, South Africa is a very different cultural context. Yeah, South Africa is incredibly, in itself, different cultural context. Africa is an entirely different type of hate speech discourse. You know, understanding the languages, building deep learning for those languages, very early stage. India, we haven't even cracked how to do it. So even when we think, oh, platforms need to do something, platforms can only go so far. You know, they can say, well, this is hate speech, and that's a very small portion. But all the uncivil speech, the stuff where people are just offensive, and the images are offensive and whatever, that's a much more difficult thing to deal with. And I think that the piece of work that Colm's done and led on this is interesting in that context, because it's pointing out that actually we're only at the very, very thin level of scratching the surface. You know, we're really at the veneer. I was looking at data set today, and I just pulled 1 million tweets from Euro 2020. So it was the men's Euro. And 2.4% of all original tweets and mentions contained a feminine slur or a sexism towards women. And that was the men's Euro. Okay, so
and that's with the official hashtags as well.
Yeah. So
Not
that's
off the cuff remarks.
and that's not the retweets. That's just 2.4. So, and that's where we're confident, above 95% confident, that that's sexist towards women. Do you know what I mean? So that's before you get into all the other stuff. So, but the interesting thing, myself and Gary were looking at, it's always around 1 to 2.5%. But what people forget is the raw number has increased dramatically over that period. So this is a massive tsunami of incivility. Do you know what I mean? And that's a challenge. I think it's a big challenge. And I think it requires these coalitions of lots of different people. And it's great to see people from Brazil in this, and Tunisia and Italy, and, you know, because it requires taking this from a whole variety of different ways.
Yeah,
But
absolutely,
it's
Theo.
presentation.
Like, that's why, you know, even with this webinar series, we're going to try and have as international a perspective as possible each month, to try to get someone from a different region every month. I'm conscious of time. I know, Roshni, you have your hand up again. Just maybe one last question before we head off. Roshni. Yeah.
Just a quick comment, and this is also a fantastic opportunity of how business / federations and sociology intersect, because you can't look at the one now without the other. It's about human beings and social behavior.
Yeah, absolutely, Roshni. And I think that kind of I suppose what we might call like whole scale intersectional approach is the way to go with this. Like looking at that takes out businesses and human behavior, but also to build on what Theo said, that takes kind of an approach that like encompasses like the relationship between online and offline hate, and the relationship between what happens on kind of major social media platforms and more covert forms of online hate, like attacks via email and so on. One that kind of looks at the, you know, how these different cultures interact, rather than look at one incident playing out on one platform at a given time. There are interesting insights that can be yielded by that, but it's kind of I think the future of this is definitely throwing the net wider in the way we look at it, to take a more intersectional approach.
Thank you for joining the webinar. Please keep a lookout for details concerning the next series of speakers.